Corporations are going to have to learn to grow up to keep pace with the changing demands of their customers, namely sharing, which is, of course, against the bottom line of corporations because they're trying to cut cost, not increase it. And sharing is giving away the wealth of the corporation without a whole lot of benefit coming back to the corporation. So corporations as we know them today will no longer exist in the during the Aquarian dispensation, which has already started with the freeing of the slaves by Lincoln 150 years ago. But it hasn't come into full swing. It's got a ways to go. In the course of warming up to it, though, corporations are going to change so much that they will kind of disappear and be replaced by something better. And it'll probably be more neighborly, more community-oriented. In other words, cottage industries that are set up for each community, taking care of the needs of that particular community and not thinking of the whole world, because there's nobody to make tremendous profits off of shares, having the company go public and investors and all of that business. It's just not going to be big anymore. It's going to be more flexible and more tailored to suit the needs of each local area. So consequently, cost effectiveness is going to go out the window because corporations are nothing new. They've been around since colonialism started, because when a colony was brought into being by a foreign power, it was brought into being by a business venture called a corporation, literally. East Indies, West Indies, those two different companies coming out of the British Empire, they were corporations. And they were solely for the benefit of the people who started them. Yeah, it's not for anybody else. They were there to exploit a foreign country. And not by taking it over by arms, although they had to support what they were doing by arms, but by just stealing the wealth, the natural resources of that foreign country. Well, Charlie Lutz would always say that a Piscean age was marked by exploitation and exploration, usually of the outer world, and now it's going to be mostly of the inner world, the world of mind. And the Piscean age was also dominated by feelings, while the Aquarian age is dominated by mind. And there are going to be four pillars of the age of Aquarius: peace, plenty, self-revelation or truth revealed within the individual, so there won't be 200 versions of truth running around in the name of religious beliefs, and a golden path, a golden opportunity for enlightenment, whether or not the person chooses to go there. And a lot of good people will end up in that age just because they're good people. They know how to be good, They're not selfish and narrow-minded. Maharishi used to call selfish small fish, because it's a small boundary of mind. It doesn't take much into consideration beyond survival, belonging, and domination, as Charlie would put it. Those three pillars of the first three chakras of lower consciousness, and the person just revolves and turns around and alternates among those three pillars of dominating the environment, be it people or things or animals or creatures, or raping the planet, belonging to some group larger than oneself. It gives oneself extra power and protection, and just plain survival. That's all the lower three chakras, the consciousness of the lower three chakras are concerned with. It's not until the heart opens up, and the person very often will feel like they're having a full-blown heart attack, even though they're not, is sharing, is the recognition that we're all children of the same consciousness, creation, or whatever it is we want to call it. We may not be equals, but we are entitled to have the bounty of everything that shared with each other. Of course, there's no profit motive. There's just a motive for growth and evolution, and finding out what we are supposed to grow into, you know, because the heart doesn't have all the answers. It just has all the questions. But at least it's starting to ask. Prior to that, person doesn't bother to even ask, you know, what's the purpose of life? Why am I here? Couldn't care less. How do I get to eat, you know? Where's my next meal coming from? Who's going to pay for it? So Tesla thought outside that box of limitations, and that's why he did not prosper very well. But we did manage to get some of his benefit, and other people had to come along and build on what little we were able to benefit from. Steinmetz is a perfectly good example, along with, of course, Eric Dollard. But there are many others in the pantheon of inventors who have all contributed to scientific awareness of electrodynamic theory. So I take most of my role modeling out of Eric Dollard's LMD analog computer. That's my genesis for training me how to think about what has turned out to be a study of parametric oscillations. It's already been scientifically validated for mechanical oscillations as well as electrical, although more so for mechanical and more so for magnetic as opposed to electrostatic whenever anybody does talk about the electrodynamic version of parametric oscillations. But this is where overunity and free energy comes out of, is parametric oscillations. I prefer the capacitive variety of the dielectric because it's much more powerful than the inductive variety coming out of coils. But the two have to work together anyway. Coils and caps, they have to work together in order to create these parametric oscillations in the electrodynamic field. And the LMD module of Eric Dollard's analog computer of a transmission line is perfect in that it focuses on the space, the empty space between the two, the pair of transmission wires, rather than the electrodynamic wave traveling down the wires, the length of the wires, but instead the electrostatic relationship tugging at the two wires across the empty space between them. Anywho, so after spending over a year since March of 2017, and this is August of 2018, of simulating, training my mind how to think, I keep trying to come up with circuits that are more realistic, more buildable, and a simulator version of Paul Falstad's electronic simulator that is also more realistic. So I've upgraded the equivalent series resistance of the coils, leaving the caps alone at what Wikipedia article on equivalent series resistance puts at 10 milliohms for the dielectric of the capacitor, made if the dielectric is made out of aluminum oxide, and that's the ceramic capacitors. Those are the more popular ones, and so I chose that. But for coils, I've had a hard time because coils are a little dicey. It's somewhat loosely based on the inductance of the coil, but I couldn't come up with a formula, so I just chose, in the beginning, I chose 4 ohms per Henry, and it proved to be incorrect for coils of a larger size than just tiny little coils. It was fine for tiny coils, but I never dealt with tiny coils for the most part. Well, I did occasionally, but a lot of times I dealt with larger coils, such as coils for electric motors, such as this demonstration I'm going to show you shortly. So it wasn't appropriate because it wasn't giving the appropriate resistance. You know, that's the whole point of an equivalent series resistance, especially in a coil, is acts as a positive resistor. In a capacitor, it acts as a negative resistor, and that's probably why Mother Nature decided to limit equivalent series resistance for capacitors based on the material of construction. Now, there are some like tantalum and oxide or dioxide or some kind of exotic material for the dielectric that has very high equivalent series resistance, and that means you're going to get a lot of overunity. Unfortunately, there's also another parameter involved, and that is the limitation of voltage. How much voltage can the capacitor withstand? But of course, in the similar environment, I haven't gotten that far in my attempt to be realistic. So any voltage, what happens? Whatever it does, it happens. So for coils, it's important that we get a more accurate model of its positive resistance, because that's going to impact how well we can design a circuit to operate in an overunity modality. It's going to be more difficult, more challenging, and ultimately more rewarding if we should figure it out. Well, there's always been something wrong with my circuits. Always at least one thing, sometimes only, many times only one thing wrong in terms of buildability, realism. Is it buildable? And I'm always trying to improve that. So predicated on the presumption of using, I only found 2 actual measurements for coils, their resistance versus their inductance, well, their calculated inductance, on the internet. And one was at Energetic Forum at Dave Bowling's 3-battery generator message thread. And the other was the 8th edition, or any edition for that matter, of Joseph Newman's book on his energy machine, The Energy Machine of Joseph Newman. In chapter 6, Dr. Hastings measures a table model, an earlier model of Joseph Newman's device, at 50,000 ohms on the coil and 16,000 henries. And that wasn't far off from the figures from the Dave Bowling message thread. When I applied a mathematical model that I selected, and I selected the area of a circle, because I figured that, well, first of all, it wasn't that, I didn't logically think my way through. I just monkeyed with the numbers, and I discovered that logarithms don't work. You know, the scale of musical scale is based on logarithms. The frequency of each octave is double the prior, you know, of a pitch in one octave versus another. It didn't work. It skewed the results too much to one side or the other. But the area of a circle was perfect. I was looking for a relationship between linear and exponential. In other words, the resistance along a wire is a linear relationship. The longer the wire is, in terms of feet, inches, whatever, then the more resistance it's going to have for a fixed diameter, you know, if the diameter doesn't change. And that's a linear relationship, a linear proportion relationship between the length of that wire and its resistance. But when we start to coil it into a coil, now it's no longer a linear relationship with inductance. Inductance now becomes some kind of multiplicative or exponential relationship, and I couldn't find the right formula until I came upon the area of a circle, and that seems to be the best one, because thematically it makes sense, or logistically. If you take the cross-section of a coil, that's an area of a circle. And if the radius of the coil is somehow related loosely to its wire length and resistance as a linear relationship, then the square of the area should be loosely related to the inductance. Because, you know, formulas for calculating inductance are based on number of turns and the radius of that coil, along with the depth or width, the thickness of that coil around its bobbin. 3 different factors, but largely 2, just one used twice. Well, both are used twice, actually, or a couple of times. Anyway, so what I did was I took the 2 groups of data, one from the Dave Bowling's message thread and one from Joseph Newman's book, and then I computed the data. I did the figures, you know, and I came up with per Henry, the resistance on a coil, according to the Newman data, is around just under 400 ohms per Henry, while at 1 Henry, excuse me, at 1 Henry. While at 1 Henry for the David Bowling data, I think it was Matt who gave this data, actually. I forget his last name or his first name. His data suggested for 1 Henry it would be the ohmage slightly more than 300 ohms. So I chose the greater of the 2, the worst case scenario, not knowing what to choose. I wanted to challenge myself as much as possible, yet still stay realistic according to something that actually happened in the real world. Now, Newman's motor is largely inefficient. We know all this, and it's predicated on having as much resistance as possible because it's to its advantage to do so. While motors, because the Newman machine is not a motor strictly speaking, it's just a big fat coil. But motors they have to be more efficient. And so they want their resistance to be as low as possible because they want their current to be high. So 300 is probably more realistic, but I chose 400 because I wanted to challenge myself as much as possible. So now this circuit you see here was designed specifically for this new upgraded software. All the prior circuits that I've done prior to this date, today is the September 2nd, 2018. Well, I did the software upgrade on the 31st of August, 3 days ago. So prior to the 31st of August, or prior to today, any of my prior circuits probably won't work very well if they're predicated on resonance of the components within the circuit. Then they'll probably either flash flame into over unity instantaneously and explode, or just sit there and do nothing. Now, a lot of my earlier circuits, before I put in equivalent series resistance, don't work anymore under equivalent series resistance in producing over unity. They just sit there. They don't explode. I wish they did. I don't think so. In most cases, 2/3 of my circuit work prior to my instigation of equivalent series resistance don't work anymore under the realistic simulator. So I have 3 different simulators. I have the first simulator that I took from that I downloaded from Paul Falstad, and I call it NE. So it's at NE for negative resistance, the 2 first letters of negative. So that's at vinyasi.info/N as in Nancy, E as in Edward. Then the realistic simulator is vinyasi.info/realsim, REALSIM. And then I have a step simulator, which I don't keep up. I thought it was an interesting idea, interesting novelty, but it doesn't really help anything. And that's at vinyasi.info/stepsim. But the real sim, I keep trying to upgrade and make improvements on. So I just focus on that one, and I ignore the other 2 simulators. I don't upgrade them anymore. And I try to devise new circuits that will work in the upgraded software. So this one works, but I added an additional challenge. I took away trapezoidal approximation. Now, according to Paul Falstad's comments in his software code, trapezoidal approximation is more accurate. But sometimes you can get weird answers. And when he says weird, we just have to translate that into over unity, parametric oscillations. It overexcites parametric oscillations. The capacitive reactance overreacts. And, you know, he designed the software for AC circuits, DC circuits, but electrodynamic theory allows for parametric oscillations by its very nature. So simulators can't help but exhibit parametric oscillations, and that's why very often they take policies against the surges that result from parametric oscillations. For instance, microcap is the worst. They give it a very tiny microsecond or a nanosecond of duration of lifespan, and then they suppress it outright, microcap. And the more stringent the policy, the more popular is the simulator in universities to use in the lab section of students' curriculum. It's quite amazing. Because in today's world, we're geared for one thing and one thing only, money. I want to get paid. And I'm not going to get paid if the transmission line generates a parasitic transient, a surge, and burns out half the neighborhood and gives a brownout or a blackout. And I'm not going to get paid if the motherboard in the computer chips that I'm marketing for motherboards and computers fries itself because it develops a surge. So in today's world, surges are suppressed by and large and then outright denied that they even exist. But electrical engineers are taught how to suppress them using snubber circuits and other techniques, and then to deny that they even exist of any merit, so they don't just deny that, why think about it? We suppress them and then move on to something else. Well, I try to capitalize on using it as a power source, as a secondary voltage source, to become of primary importance, because batteries are kind of worthless. They, discharge so quickly and you got to go get another one. John Bedini complained the same way. Well, I don't like them any more than John Bedini does, but I try to not use them, except to initiate a minor charge on a circuit. Now, in this case, I don't use a battery for that purpose. I use an aerial to supply the initial charge, and then I break it off. But I'm very careful in protecting my environment from that aerial, acting as a broadcast aerial, producing radio interference, bringing the wrath of the FCC down on my ugly little head, and take everything, including my toothbrush. They can be nasty. All you have to do is read about what happened to the Evie Gray motor team of Richard Hackenberger, the second raid they went through. The first one was bad enough from the DA's office of Los Angeles County, but the FCC raid topped the DA raid by a wide margin, because Richard Hackenberger never had a AM radio playing music nearby. Otherwise he would have noticed, as they swept the various channels tuning the device, that they're producing radio interference of a very large degree. So it didn't take long for the FCC to locate them, triangulate, find them, and then issue a warrant for confiscating everything. And they were lucky they had motors in secret warehouse locations to continue their research. So Richard Hackenberger learned how to, and Richard Hackenberger had a problem. They had so much energy they had to throw it away, because the motor could only use so much, and they were blowing up batteries, using batteries as their ground, because they figured a car couldn't ground to the earth, being a movable object insulated with rubber tires, so they were blowing up batteries to ground out the excess energy. And then the FCC shows up. Well, that was Mother Nature's way of slapping them around and giving them an opportunity, a challenge to upgrade. They really, really make an effort to upgrade. And Richard Hackenberger came up with a methodology, was to blow air, compressed air, through the interior space of the motor and make some other changes that were very important that I won't get into. Mark McKay deals with it, to effectively ionize that compressed air and then carry those ions out of the interior space into the exterior space, and then those ions could then ground themselves to nearby objects. But this was a conversion that he managed to do of the electromagnetic and electrostatic field that he was creating, the high voltage and the high magnetic, into ions, ionization of the air, and effectively kill, to a large degree, the interference that he was creating in his local environment, and thus be okay with the FCC, and get rid of the excess energy at the same time. So he solved a couple of problems, one he didn't know he had, and one that he knew he had. So that's one technique, and that's what I'm implying here by this fake circuit that surrounds this, that's grounded to the earth. A kind of Faraday cage, well, not a kind of, but it is a Faraday cage, and you can have two different types of grounding for a Faraday cage, depending on what you're trying to ground out. If you're only trying to ground out electrostatic interference you're putting into your environment, then you only need grounded at one point. These are the rules for grounding a coaxial cable. But if you're trying to ground out the electromagnetic interference, you'll end up grounding out both that and the electrostatic by using two grounding points on your coax cable or Faraday cage rather than just one. And so I put two here to maximally try to remove or filter the create a boundary around this space so that the electrostatic and electromagnetic interference does not emanate beyond this cage. So this is the other way to do it besides blowing air through this cage. If you can't ground it, then you blow air through it at a very high rate. And I suspect to some limited degree the aerial on the backside of Tesla's Pierce Arrow demonstration of his EV conversion of in 1931 in Buffalo, New York, was blowing air across the very tall aerial. And so it managed somewhat to ionize the air. But something interesting. Not only did Pierce Arrow go out of business immediately after the demonstration, but the FCC came into existence 3 years after the demonstration in 1934. It came into existence. So I suspect he was putting out interference into his environment and somebody got savvy to it, or else they suspected anybody doing high voltage experiments like Tesla should be regulated out of existence, and so they, prevented from doing so. But, all we have to do is make safeguards to prevent problems from arising, and then we're not going to have to worry about being regulated out of existence by the FCC. I mean, yeah, it's a way to suppress free energy development, but only if you're not educated enough on this subject to know what to look out for ahead of time and take necessary precautionary measures to prevent disaster, sociological disaster for your personal self in your garage. Even though you think you're alone in the garage tinkering away and nobody will notice, they'll notice. And John Bedini, you know, the first time I read about it, John Bedini kept warning us, you know, about this. Don't mess around with anything that will attract the attention of the FCC, because they will not let you go gently into the night. Okay, enough about that. So what I learned about this type of thinking is you have to think now in terms of two modalities. Unfortunately, we're all programmed to think about thermodynamics, the laws of thermodynamics. You have to think in terms of losses. All your circuit is going to do is entropy, service entropy, lose, convert, lose by way of conversion. And we never think of surges, which is the other side of the coin. So I have to put both into my circuit. You have to take the time to surge the circuit, and then you have to take the time to drain it. And when you're draining it, you're using it. When you're surging it, you're not using it. So I suggest that you have a clutch arrangement. This is why this old style, no motor controller, no computer chip, just the driver regulating everything. This is perfect in that Tesla, all he had to do was leave the clutch in the car, the stick shift clutch, because every time he wanted to, if, assuming this circuit kind of thematics has anything to do with what he did, and I'm supposing that there was some relationship, that he had to know that you had to surge and you had to drain, you had to alternate between the two phases. So all he had to do, though, is depress the clutch so that the motor would be free spinning when he applied any pressure to the foot pedal, the accelerator pedal, to engage a surge. Because the motor would speed up its RPMs, and you wouldn't want that connected to the car right away, because you would lurch forward. It would very abruptly. He'd probably snap your neck and give you whiplash. So then you have to ease out the clutch to slowly engage the speed of the motor with the speed of the drive shaft, so that you can gradually increase your speed of the car and everybody in it to match the new accelerated speed of the motor that is now undergoing surge. Now, I tried the idea of disconnecting the motor, and it doesn't work. See, the circuit, all it does is back up the motor to create stability during drain mode, so that the energy is there for several seconds or a few minutes or whatever, so that the motor can run in drain mode and not lose appreciable speed. So you can't disconnect the motor from the power supply when you're surging. You're surging everything. You're surging the motor coils along with the power supply behind it, namely the capacitors and transformer coils. They all have to surge at the same time, but they won't surge at the same amount. The capacitors don't store a whole lot of energy, interestingly enough, in this circuit. The coils on the transformer store a tremendous amount of energy, and the motor coils also store a certain amount, but not as much as the transformer coils. So the transformer coils take the brunt of energy storage in this circuit arrangement, while the capacitors are regulating the surges. They are creating the parametric oscillations. And it's really two halves of a circle. An LMD module is not a circle. It's made to look like one so that it can fit into how our circuits work. Our circuits are based on loops, on circles, on circuit. That's what the word circuit comes from. But the LMD module is really two halves that will never be a whole circle in its intrinsic sense. And it's a beautiful thing because it's two pendulous swings of a pendulum going back and forth, one on one side and one on the other side for each LMD module. Take away one capacitor, if you're left with one capacitor and one or more coils, then all you have is a tank circuit, which becomes a driven oscillator. You have to drive it with an outside energy source. But a parametric oscillator is self-driving, but does require a certain amount of energy to start with. It's kind of like the old jalopies that you'd have to hand crank, only in this case, we give it a little charge from an aerial. Now I put a capacitor here on either side because I'm charging both LMD modules at the same time, hopefully with the same amount of charge. They just won't be the same polarity, but that's okay because they're isolated from each other because of this transformer down the middle. But I want the two pairs of coils on either side to be as much equally weighted in energy as possible. So I put a capacitor here to kind of balance the forces of a microfarad. You know, I just chose an arbitrary amount. It's not important how much, at least for the purpose of the simulator. And then feed the energy directly down a wire with no resistance getting in the way, except for these two switches, of course. They're 20 ohms closed and 10 gigohms open to go into each of these two central LMD modules, because I just have to charge up these two central modules. Now I could charge on the outside, but it's not as effective as charging the inside. The inside is very efficient. Now FS, these spark gaps represent a flint and steel cigarette lighter contraption. 4 years ago, I knew that I needed to think about sparking devices to put into a circuit, and I was very much interested in building, but I had no knowledge or expertise. So I went and ordered online a barbecue igniter, and I realized when I received it, it wouldn't work because it has two wires that you're supposed to connect to the AC line running to your barbecue. And I'm trying to disconnect myself from the grid at the moment here and make myself independent of the grid as a user of energy. So that was the last thing I needed. So then I thought to myself, well, what else? There must be something else that creates sparks. Oh, wait a minute. Because I was trying to be creative in terms of materials of construction. You know, what can I work with in my environment? So then I thought to myself, oh, what about these mechanical hand-operated cigarette lighters? They use a piece of flint and a wheel that's made, I think, of steel and some rotary device inside there that creates the sparks. What about that? And so I didn't, but I couldn't figure out how to connect it to a circuit. That escaped me. You know, the barbecue igniter was already set up to be connected to a circuit, namely the AC power. But a cigarette lighter is not intended to be connected to any circuit. It's a manual mechanical device, a manually operated mechanical device. So only recently, a few days ago, I woke up with the image in my brain from a dream just before waking up so that I could carry it with me into the waking state of the cigarette lighter flint and steel arrangement again. And again, the question arose, well, but how do I connect it to a circuit? And I put my attention on it, but this time I came up with the answer, and probably because now I have 4 years of background of studying the matter and simulating stuff and reading up on it, you know, why do my simulations work? So I have a better chance of answering my own question than I did. And that is, my first attempt, my first solution was to connect the metallic part, the steel part, to the circuit. But I knew right away that wasn't going to work because it would just end up becoming a short. But then I realized that the flint is a capacitor, is the dielectric of a capacitor. You're rubbing a dielectric of a capacitor, an insulator. You're rubbing an insulator against a piece of metal. And that's what we used to do in the old days. We'd say take a piece of steel wool and a piece of felt and rub the felt, or no, take a steel rod and take a felt cloth and surround the steel rod with a felt cloth and give it a good few rubs. And then touch the steel rod, and if you're holding the rod with plastic gloves, then you get a static discharge. And so you're rubbing an insulator against a metallic object to create that electrostatic charge. And that's what the flint and steel cigarette lighter does. Well, the insulator, the felt cloth, is a dielectric, and that's what the flint is. So wouldn't it be appropriate then to connect both sides of the flint to the circuit? One connection one side, one connection the other side. And I use a spark gap here to emulate the flint of a flint and steel cigarette lighter. But I've changed the parameters, and I borrowed it from another circuit design. I realized I already have it. And I use 1 femto ohm for on resistance, 1 nano ohm for off resistance, and 1 femto volt for its breakdown voltage, but I retained the 3 milliamps for the holding current. Not that I know what holding current means. So I only changed the first 3 parameters from my prior use of a spark gap for neon bulbs. You know, I had 65 volts as the breakdown voltage, and I think it was 3 kilo ohms for the on resistance and 10 mega ohms for the off resistance. But I chose very low, and this was supposed to simulate a sparking brush contact in a brush-oriented DC motor. But then I realized, hey, I can use that same concept for a flint and steel cigarette lighter, because it'll readily spark at low voltages, namely anything above 1 femtovolt. And it'll keep sparking, and that's the concept here, is that we have this flint and steel rotary wheel steel portion of this device, and we mechanically turn the wheel when we want to engage this circuit in a surge mode to create sparks. So, you know, it gives a new definition to a spark gap, basically, in that we don't depend on a voltage breakdown. That's not the purpose here. The purpose, and then wait for the sparks to happen. Instead, we create the sparks mechanically using an outside input of energy. It could be a small electric starter motor, or it could, and then switch over to the drive shaft of the car. In any case, something to turn the metallic wheel to create the sparks on the flint, so that either side will generate a waveform, this is important, of a spark. It's not important how much, you know, the intensity of the spark. I could care less. In fact, I have to tone, well, the funny thing about a resistor in this circuit is that anytime you put a resistor, such as the resistance of these switches and a resistor here, all it does is act as a negative resistor. It's really uncanny. And then you have to worry about resonance. So more or less resistance is not the key. The key is finding the right one that's suitable for what you're trying to do. You want stability, you want gradual growth, you know, you don't want sudden explosion. Because, you know, when dynamite explodes, it's also an electrical event, along with being a chemical event. And if you can duplicate the electrical portion, then you can do away with the chemical portion and not even bother using any chemistry whatsoever. Just use a circuit to do the same thing. That's essentially what surge-oriented circuits do, is create an explosion of energy. But I don't want it to happen suddenly. I want it to be gradual and manageable and usable, as well as being over unity surge explosiveness. So I have to learn all these different tricks to try to regulate the darn thing, because it's really tricky, especially when you throw away trapezoidal approximation. So I have this sparking device here, which is not a spark gap, but I have to use a spark gap to simulate it. And it sparks continually, more or less, when it's in use, when these switches close. And then I use 1.2 mega ohms of resistance to find the right resonance to go with the capacitor that's in this loop, this sub-circuit loop, of 39 millifarads. And remember, each capacitor has 10 milliohms of equivalent series resistance, while the coils are a different matter. Now the coils I got to be very low, 12 millihenries on each coil, because anything higher, it's explosive, it's horrible. And 12 was just right. It was just fine. And then 1 Henry, of course, is the motor coil. It's just an arbitrary amount. But the transformer coils are important. They have to match the capacitors because they have to work with them, because this is the power supply in here. What else? Oh, now this capacitor is very important. Sometimes I tried putting a resistor here, but that's not very, it doesn't lend itself to stability. I'll get a lot of spikes on the voltage readout, you know, here. I don't get a nice flat line in drainage mode. So I ended up having to go with a capacitor, and of a very large amount. 1 megafarad is pretty hard to come by. Or even, you'd have to assemble a lot of 100 farad capacitors in parallel to get to that amount. But regardless, for the purpose of being as idealistically perfect as possible, and in the simulator environment I get to do that, I chose 1 megafarad for stability of voltage so that the voltage doesn't vary and you don't get spikes of voltage, because I want the right voltage to supply the right amount of torque coming out of the motor, mechanical torque, to move around a heavy 3,000-pound RAV4 EV, which is my model for what I'm trying to subject myself to. So I don't use 144 volts as my model. I use 300 volts because I want a lot of torque. And people who want to accelerate into traffic, they want a lot of torque as well. So they're not going to go with an EV model of 150 volts. They're going to want 300 volts, which is more similar to the torque output of a gasoline car. If you want to accelerate into traffic, you want to zoom. And most people, Americans, are accustomed to very zoomy cars. So 300 volts is more acceptable to the consumer. And that's the whole point of my study of electrodynamic theory, is to try to make electric cars more user-friendly, more similar to what we're accustomed to. Now, I pre-charge the capacitor with negative 300 volts to get the right polarity, and to give myself that 300 volts right away. So the only thing the circuit has to do is build up current, act as a current source, a current drain. It does not have to apply voltage. It could if I wipe out everything and start from a cold start, but then I would have to build up my current and then use my mouse wheel to lower the ohmage, the resistance on this resistor, to allow the voltage to rise. In other words, to allow the current to transfer and translate into voltage. And then some of it will be at a loss of the voltage, at a small loss of the current, but not much. And then when I get the right voltage level, and then I raise the capacitance of this capacitor back up again to an amount that locks in the voltage that it has accumulated. So one way or another, it's designed to be here to stabilize voltage and to hold on to it. And so we can pre-charge it. And this is what I think was inside the mysterious box that Tesla had on the car seat to his immediate right of his driver's seat in the Pierce Arrow demonstration. It was not 12 radio tubes and wire. That was all a charade for the purposes of throwing Paul Sarvo off the truth of the matter. Because, Tesla tolerated Mr. Sarvo. He was a young guy, and Tesla knew at that point that his ideas were being stolen left and right, out from under him. His patent attorney was stealing from him, and Paul Sarvo was no exception, or Savo, whatever his name was. He was not his cousin, and Tesla knew it. But that doesn't mean the rest of the story is not valid just because Savo was there lying that he was a cousin. He told everybody he was Tesla's cousin, and Tesla knew better, but Tesla kind of put up with him. He didn't argue with him and tell him you're a liar. He just put up with him, and that, sends a message to people. Oh, Tesla's a softie and can easily be pushed around. Well, Tesla had better things to do than to argue and fight with people anyway. So let's see. So I think Tesla made a obvious gesture to go to an electronics shop immediately upon arriving to Buffalo by train to make it look like that's all that's going to go into that box are 12 radio tubes and a bunch of wire. And it kind of goes along with the theology of the wireless transmission of power. So everybody thinks that's all that box was designed to do, was to pick up radio energy, beamed by radio wave, beamed to the car, or, in general for the car to pick up. And of course that's a bunch of charade lie. All that was inside there was a bank of capacitors pre-charged at the hotel room with the necessary quantity of voltage to operate the AC motor that was inside that EV conversion of the Pierce Arrow from 1931, because a 4,000-pound Pierce Arrow is going to need a lot of torque to move itself around. And so he'll need a pre-charged capacitor, regardless of what circuit design he's got, he's going to need a precharged capacitor. Or spend a lot of time charging the capacitor from a cold start, which the story says he didn't do. He said almost immediately he said he had power the minute he connected the box and turned it on by pushing in the 2 aluminum rods. He said, we now have power. After he looked at his dials on the dashboard, we now have power. So a few seconds at most. So that was a precharged capacitor inside that box, or a bank of them in parallel, connected with each other and connected in parallel with a motor. Because it's very common practice, and Tesla was the one who suggested this initially, was the first one to suggest to put a capacitor across, or in parallel, if you prefer, across the terminals of a AC motor to help it. So, of course, he'd use it. It was his suggestion. And that's what was in the box. And that's what he did at the hotel room, was charge it up very secretly using the AC plug in his hotel room. No problem there. Maybe he had the capacitor delivered to him, sent to the hotel in advance, and all he had to do was pick it up. Go downstairs in the middle of the night when Paul wasn't around and say, hey, I'd like my package, please, and take it up to his hotel room and connect it to the outlet in his room and charge it up. Anywho, let's see what else. I've always had a problem with, okay, you've got a surge. Now what do you do with it when you want to shut the thing off? My first success story, I tried shutting it off, and all it did was escalate to infinity even faster. And that's when I first learned that voltage sources act as anchor weights. They slow down surges. They don't prevent them, but they slow them down. They might prevent them, actually. It depends on the situation, though, actually. And the realism of your simulator, for that matter. So I've never ever learned how to shut down a surge-oriented circuit. You think you'd know how, right? Break up all these components, ground them out, self-short them. It don't work. You'll take just as long trying to short it out as you would just trying to let this thing run itself down, which could take a long time. So, there's a component in the old-style TV, cathode ray tube style TV sets that nobody uses anymore, although I do. And that piece in there, it has warning on the side of it. If you open up the back side of your TV, don't touch this, because it does not drain its charge in any quick amount of time when you turn off the TV. It holds the charge for quite some time. And an electrician, a TV repairman, knows, if they know how to repair old-style TVs still, they know how to ground it out properly in order to get rid of that excess charge, so they can open that up if they have to try to fix it or repair it or see if there's anything wrong going on with it. So that's kind of similar with this device, except they know how to ground it. I don't. I've never learned how to ground out any of these circuits. So it came to me, that's not a problem. That's an asset waiting to be utilized. And so I realized, you know what? We could all become power stations in our own independent contractor right to do so for our local utility company. And won't they just love us? Because anytime we park somewhere, we can plug our car into the grid, and instead of charging the car's batteries, which it does not have anymore, right? Except for a tiny battery to operate this switch, but these switches, but 2.5 volts. But you see over here, it's 0 amps, so it's just volts that operates these switches. So we plug it into the grid, not to get charged, but to charge the grid, to supply energy to the grid, and hopefully give this circuit somewhere to run itself down, to drain itself. And so we would need, instead of a charger at the charging station, or a charger in the car for that matter, all we need is a DC to AC inverter and other stuff to convert the drainage here into an appropriately shaped and intense AC waveform that will supply electrical energy to the local neighborhood power grid. So it doesn't matter. Anywhere you park, you're servicing the grid, and you're for free, you know, you're just giving it away, unless they have meters, and you know, unless all these stations have meters and you get credit on your credit card or your account card for that station in which you're supplying energy to the grid. That would make sense in today's commercial world. Yeah, I was thinking of the sharing world. No, that's not here yet. So yeah, we would get credit, and we could use that credit somehow for what, I don't know. But we'd be supplying energy to the grid. And that's how to get rid of this surge, or at least put it to good use while we're parked. And we're not going to get rid of too much. It's amazing how long this stuff lasts. It does dwindle down. But this 1 megafarad capacitor is not going to lose its voltage anytime soon. And so that helps regulate or helps maintain the stability of the current. So this circuit, as it's designed, whether or not we can build it with a 1 megafarad capacitor here or a capacitor bank, as it's designed, it'll hold on to its current and its voltage for quite some time. It could be weeks. So you won't be... I know, in Tesla's demonstration, I'm pretty sure he did use the foot pedals, so it may not be weeks. But, you know, this is just a simulation, so whatever. The real world, you'll actually have to apply the foot pedal, which means when you charge the grid, it may not last that long. It may last a few minutes. But at least you'll have a place to discharge to. And you're not really discharging, in a sense. I mean, you're not grounding out the circuit. You are discharging, though, to the grid, but you're not grounding out the circuit. In as much as it's not instantaneous of a loss. It's a gradual loss because now you're supplying energy to the grid, and the grid will be consuming what you have to offer rather than the mechanical motion of the car that will consume the energy of this circuit inside, you know, converting the mechanical energy and the electrical energy, interacting with each other inside the electric motor of the car. Now, the motor of the car in this simulator does not have to be AC. In fact, it has to be DC, I believe. Because when this surges, it doesn't create an AC waveform like a lot of my other circuits do. It simply jumps up in a straight line or else jumps down, and then you cut it off. So there's no chance. It's a unidirectional impulse, a DC impulse. So an AC motor may not be appropriate. Maybe a universal motor or else a DC motor without brushes, though. I would hope. I would like to think. But because everything seems to be DC oriented for the most part, macroscopically. But if you were to analyze these waveforms microscopically, you'd find out that they have a compressed AC waveform inside of them, because the nature of the LMD module is AC. There's no getting around it. Yet, for some reason, uncannily, the output looks like a DC waveform, just flatlining. So maybe a universal motor would be more appropriate, at least something without brushes, I would imagine, I suppose. I don't understand motors too well. I don't study them, so that's a whole nother issue in its own right. But I'm imagining either a DC motor of some type or another, or a universal motor, and probably not an AC motor. For this particular class of circuits, the three that I'm going to show you. Now this one comes pre-charged. I have two that are pre-charged and one that comes cold that you get to play with straight from ground zero. And this one is pre-charged for 220 amps and 300 volts. They're both volts. They're both the same volts, 300 volts. But one is 220 amps and the next one will be 50 amps. So you see, the minute you start it up, you get 300 volts and you get 226.4 amps on this set of coils and 213.03 amps on this set of coils. And the average between them is approximately 220 amps. But the voltage is exactly the same. That's one thing you don't have to worry. Now, if you wind these on the same, each of these 4 wires on the same coil, it'll all average out. Or if you pair them off, one coil from here paired with another coil from here, it'll average out ultimately. Anyway, what else? Oh, the random nature of surges. Unfortunately, and this is a caveat, besides this 1 megafarad bank of capacitors, one of the caveats to this particular circuit is you don't know what you're going to get when you seek to get it. So every time you snap this snap switch to surge the circuit, or maybe hold it down for a slight instant to get things running, because beyond a certain point, snapping won't work. It'll take you to a certain level of charge, and you won't go any further. So then you got to hold it down slightly longer than just a snap. But it's random. And one of the randomness is that the polarity keeps flipping. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. And the other issue of random activity or random outcome is you don't know what you're going to get. I mean, you know, within a certain, once you play with this and get your body trained how long to hold this down for, and you're watching the little dots, the yellow current dots running around, when you get an idea, you know, on the dashboard of the car, it would be the RPM meter, because the current would show up as RPM on the motor, and you depressed the clutch. When you're monkeying with surges, you depress the clutch so the motor can spin freely, and then you watch the dashboard on the RPM meter to see how you're doing. Because if you overshoot and get your RPMs too high, you're not going to want to use that. You're going to lurch forward and break your neck. So you got to keep the clutch depressed and try again. And this time, don't hold it down. Just give it a snap, and you'll lose energy. So this is a parametric oscillator par excellence, because you can both synthesize and decompose electricity on the spot to your heart's desire, to a certain, well, not to your heart's desire, to a certain limit of decomposition. You might go down to an amp, you know. But if you hold this, you'll go up pretty high. So you don't want to hold it too long. But if you go too high, you just flick it again a few times, and that'll bring you down. But remember, you have to still keep depressing the clutch so you don't break your neck. And then once you see the RPMs on your dashboard in the window of what you're shooting for, your target of what you're trying to increase your motor speed to, then you ease out on the clutch pedal to engage the drive shaft with the motor, the rotating motor, so that you can accelerate the car into this new energy level that you've given it. So it takes a little dexterity and getting used to this kind of driving style. And it does require a clutch if you're trying to go back to the old style of doing things without any microcontroller, motor controller, car computer, nothing that stands between you and the operation of your car in a very large sense. So you get to throw out all those circuitries that may be great in today's world, but when we go back to the age of Tesla, we have to go back to simple, primitive methodologies, because they work and because they're more suited for an analog situation that's largely not predictable as it is. So how can you tell a computer what to do? You could. It'd be a very sophisticated computer, and then you wouldn't have to worry about operating a manual clutch. You could let the car do all of that for you. But in the beginning, we have to do things the way Tesla probably did them, and that would be a manual clutch. You leave it in when you do your EV conversion, or you get a car with a clutch if you can find one, and a manual transmission with a manual clutch. Good luck in today's world. Have to go back to well, anyway. Let's see, what else did I cover? Oh, that was it. So let's just turn it on. I've been talking and not showing you anything. So this is, and then I had to reset the current speed so that I could get a good sense of, just by looking at this, am I in my target without having to look at these numbers? Because it's hard to look at a dial, or it's hard to look at the oscilloscope, you know, down below. So let's go get is this the one? No, this is the one. No. Yeah, this is the one. So this is the 50 amp one, and you see here everything's in the negative. The volts are negative, the amps are negative. We got 50 amps negative and 300 volts negative, and our watts is 14.9 kilowatts. And the AC source is showing some wattage, nanowatts, only because this this resistor here, this 10 gigaohm resistor, is 10 gigaohms instead of 1 petaohm. You know, if I drag this up to 1 petaohm, I won't get anything showing up here at all. Oh, I forgot to make this maximum scale. I'll have to change my... Okay, so now you get to see the waveforms. It's, oh, see, it zeroes it out. So let's reset this. And then you don't get nothing. It's zero. Nothing gets through. So even though the switch here is open, we still have an aerial exhibiting a certain amount of wattage. And that wattage is going to show up in the electrostatic and electromagnetic immediate vicinity. And we don't want to get anybody's attention. So 1 petaohm is ideal, but I don't expect anybody to have a 1 petaohm resistor anytime soon. So I chose 10 gigaohms because that's somewhat doable. And that'll allow the aerial to exhibit nanowatts, basically, if it's picking up somewhere between 15 and 20 volts from the air. Now, normally an aerial does not. It's more like half a volt, or more like 5 to 10 microvolts. So we're not going to get a whole lot of volts from this aerial, but we don't need to. We just have to give a minimal charge to the circuit to give it some juice to get, of an ember, so that we can fan that ember into a bonfire. We don't need much. We don't need any specific amount, just something. So stray charges may get in here anyway, a dry, cold winter day, You touch the handle on your car, It won't take much. But I want to protect us from the FCC, and so I thought 10 gigaohms would be adequate to do the job, because if the aerial is only exhibiting nanowatts, then it probably won't compete with anybody's radio, and so nobody will complain, and we should be safe. Yeah, I forgot to do this. So let's go back to the other circuit now that I've realized my error. I have to change all my circuits now. This one. Yeah, I forgot to do... Is this mega? No, max. Yeah, maximum scale. So you see, again, it's nanowatts. And if we engage this, now it becomes watts and it becomes watts, and I went too high. Now I've got half a mega amp. That's a bit much. So I just give it a flick, and look how it shoots down to negative 7 kiloamps. And I give it another flick. Now it goes up to 35. I give it another flick, and it shoots opposite polarity 20 kiloamps, and I give it another flick, and what do we have here? Oh, we have 700 kiloamps. That's a lot. I give it another flick, and now we've got, what is that? 13 kiloamps. So it keeps jumping around. It's very arbitrarily random. But you notice it doesn't go lower than a kiloamp. It stays in the kiloamp range. So it's going to be pretty difficult. Actually, I was wrong about 1 amp. It'll stay above 1 kiloamp, basically. And that's too much, so whoops. So now I can't get rid of it. Oops. So you better be careful when you play with this thing. Well, it depends. Now, the Tesla Motors car, the motor for the Tesla Motors car, actually operates at 1.5 kiloamps. And I'm guessing, from dim memory, 340 volts. It's not a lightweight car, so they have to have 340 volts to move it around, even though it's an aluminum chassis. Well, no, they want 340 volts for the torque, for good acceleration, because Tesla motor, users and buyers pay for torque, so they want a high voltage on that motor. But it is 1.5 kiloamps to provide adequate speed. When that gets converted into frequency by the AC, for the requirement of the AC motor, it needs 1.5. It needs all those amperage for speed. But we can't see now I'm mega amps, then I'm back down to 3 kiloamps on the positive side. 3.5. No, 15. Oh yeah, 16. 16.9. It looks like 16.9. Yeah, 16.9 kiloamps. So it's very arbitrarily random. Now let's try, the last one is the cold start one. Now I have 300 volts pre-charged. So you see everything light up, and you get 300 volts, and the amps are slowly shifting in the negative direction. We've got milliamps, 4 milliamps, 5 milliamps, 6 milliamps. So now let's give it a flick and reset this to see what we've got. And we've got 2 3/4. We didn't get anything. So let's hold it down a little bit. Whoops. Now that was a little too much of a little bit. So now we have 2.4 kiloamps. If I give it a flick, it goes up rather than down. Now I have 968 amps. It's still a little high. Ah, that's a little better. That went down. See, in the beginning, you might have a better luck of going down. See, now this, what is that? Oh, if I don't have my glasses on, I can't see a darn thing. 3.6 amps, see? So now I've recovered because I did it early enough before I got into the kiloamp range in which I would not recover at all. But the voltage is still 300 volts, right on the mark, see? It's all because of this capacitor is holding on to the voltage. So now let's see if we can raise the amps ever so gently. And we lowered it, actually, down to milliamps. So if you do it early on enough, you can recover. So let's try again. Now we're up to, oh, that's a lot. Oh, what is that? What did my poor eyesight tell me? That's, oh, half a kiloamp. So I went too high. So let's see if I give it a flick. Now that's still too high. Give it another flick. Ah, now that's a little better. We decomposed energy and threw it away. Now that's 170. So that's perfect, 174 amps. So look how long it took me. And I didn't overshoot too much so that I could recover. And this is still 300 volts. And our wattage is, what does that say? 52 kilowatts. And 50 kilowatts is what my car operates on when it's full throttle at 200 amps. Well, this is 175 amps and 300 volts. Actually, my car wouldn't drive at 300 volts when it was operational. It's dead at the moment. It would operate at the top, well, somewhere around 288 volts, actually. So I think this completes this video, pretty much, of my latest foray into this arena, because I wanted it to be buildable as much as possible. And I've done as close a job as I can do, you know. Don't be concerned about this resistor. The simulator requires me to put a resistor in here, or else it gives me an error message when I have two grounds and simply wire between them. But for a Faraday cage, that's all you need. So it's probably a good idea for the garage to be lined, the interior wall of the garage to be lined with a Faraday style cage, and then have it grounded on opposite sides on 2 points with a good, grounding rod on each side, to give extra protection, so you don't, just to make sure, your neighbors have no reason to complain whatsoever. But when you're driving around, the chassis of the car can be a Faraday cage of sorts, but then you have to blow air across it. Well, it already has air blowing across it if you're moving fast enough, but if you haven't, pulled away from the curb yet, and your power supply is running, you have to provide compressed air somehow across some surface. Now, another possibility, and I didn't state it here, and I should have, because I don't know too much about it, but I know that initial C. Earl Aman used it, were two hollow bronze spheres. And I suspect they were some sort of specially designed aerial. And because they were hollow, It leads me to suspect he may have been doing something to, again, alleviate this condition of electrostatic interference and electromagnetic interference in the local environment. How that would be, I don't know, but I'd like to think that that's what he was attempting to do. So I have to state that here. I forgot to state that. So I have a few improvements I forgot I left out of this circuit. Anyway, that completes my video, and I hope you enjoyed it.